it is time for indie follow-up vid. So, following on the great success of my first vid, this is going to be the follow-up vid. So let me just launch into something straight away. Right, imagine you're lucky enough to own a house or at least have a mortgage on one, and one day there's a knock at your front door and it's your neighbour. Now, your neighbour's a friendly guy, but you don't have a very high opinion of him. The back garden, his back garden, is always a total mess. He just seems to use it as a place to dump things, and whereas you've got a lot of pride in your back garden, it's all nice and herbaceous borders, you know, the whole thing. And so anyway, back to the front door. So you open the door, there's your neighbour, and he says to you, "Great news! We're together and we're better together." And you say, "Sorry, what?" And he says, "Oh, it's easier if I just show you." So he drags you around to the back garden, and to your astonishment you see that the fence that used to separate your two back gardens is gone. And he says, "Look, I know you're going to be so happy because you're someone who hates division and hates borders and believes that we're all better together. Well, we're together now. I've abolished the border between our back gardens, so it's all one now. We're sharing everything. And by the way, since you hate borders and you hate division, I know that you hate the division of our wealth, our personal assets as well, so could you lend me some money? About £3 would probably do it." You might have an idea where I'm going if you've been following the Scottish independence debate with this story. The point I'm trying to make is a very simple one. Borders and division are not in themselves good or bad things. That's something you can only judge on a case-by-case basis. And actually, if you think about it, if you read a bit of psychology, one of the most basic concepts in psychology is about boundaries, healthy boundaries, maintaining healthy, appropriate boundaries. And that just reinforces the point that, sorry, one second, my laptop's doing something stupid. That just reinforces the point that, you know, boundaries are not bad. They may be, or they may be good, or they may be indifferent, but they're not automatically bad. So when you hear all the rhetoric, all the propaganda from the Better Together camp, the anti-independence camp, about us being better together and, you know, vote no borders, I think there's one group of that name. The problem with that is it's too sweeping. You can't just say that as if it's obviously true. And to return to my trusty atlas, to just make this point even more clear, if you believe that, if you believe the anti-independence propaganda, I don't know how you, let me see if I can, yeah, Scandinavia, we return once again to Scandinavia. So here you see Norway and Sweden, which share the Scandinavian peninsula. If you really believe that all borders are bad, you end up in a position where, as far as I can see, you have to believe that it's a bad thing that at the beginning of the 20th century, Norway left the union that it was in with Sweden and became an independent country. I mean, does anyone who opposes Scottish independence really have that deep belief that it was definitely a bad thing that Norway became an independent country? I think that's a very difficult argument to make, personally. I mean, there are so many different factors. First of all, you're never going to know how history would have been if Norway had remained joined to Sweden in one state, so there's no way you could determine that anyway. But just using your common sense, I mean, Norway is a pretty admirable country, at least in the opinion of many people, including me. Very little poverty there, it's a very equal society, it's a very rich society, in my experience, Norwegians are great internationalists. They're very determined to get out into the world and do things. You know, you've had UN Secretary Generals who were Norwegian, but not just on that high level, but just in general life. Norwegians can be found in every corner of the globe, and I think they are, you know, they're very outward directed, both in terms of cooperating with the rest of Scandinavia, the rest of Europe, even though they're not in the European Union, but also the world in general. There was the Oslo Peace Accords, for example, and that's just one example. So it seems to me just impossible, really, to argue convincingly that the world is worse off because of the existence of an independent Norway. And you know, that border that runs between Norway and Sweden is definitively a bad thing. It's not an argument that makes any sense to me, and to be honest, I doubt if it makes too much sense to anyone. But by all means, you know, if you think the world would be better off with Norway still joined to Sweden in the way that it used to be, then please leave a comment or post a video explaining why, because I'd love to hear the argument. So I want to talk briefly about good sources of information, especially on the economics of independence. There are 3 or 4 websites which I've found to be fantastic sources of information on Scottish independence. And, you know, I just want to say that although these are pro-independence websites, you won't find them just full of biased information. They will quote, you know, independent sources, organisations that are not pro-independence. They will quote from, for example, the Financial Times, which certainly isn't an exponent of independence for Scotland, or the OECD, many other organisations which are not in themselves in any way pro-independence, but which have carried out research relevant to Scottish independence. So I just want to mention some of those websites, because before I knew about them, I must say I found it very difficult with the mainstream media being so biased against independence on the whole. And these websites that I'm about to mention have been brilliant sources of information and, you know, solidarity and ways of connecting up to other people who want Scotland to be independent. So the first one I'm going to mention is called Newsnet Scotland. You can bang it into Google and find it. I think it's newsnetscotland.com. General news site of a pro-independence hue. And the next one I'll mention is called Wings Over Scotland. People who are active in the pro-independence campaign will know of these websites, but people who are not so directly politically active might not know them. Wings Over Scotland, very irreverent, hilarious, but also very, very serious website. That's been a brilliant source of information. And on that particular website, Wings Over Scotland, the main guy behind that website, as I understand it, or the people behind that website, have put together something called the Wee Blue Book, which is a fantastic document. You can download it for free. Just go to Wings Over Scotland website, you can download the Wee Blue Book for free, and that has questions and answers on virtually every aspect you can think of the independence debate. Someone asked me about Faslane and job losses that would go hand in hand with kicking Trident out of Scotland, which I can't wait for that to happen. There would be some job losses. A realistic estimate seems to be about 500 connected to Trident. However, the potential for those people to get jobs in an independent Scotland is massive. Jim Sillars has recently been on YouTube making the point that the MSP Chick Brodie has dived into the National Archives and found that in the early 80s the Ministry of Defence basically instructed the energy ministry, or whichever ministry was responsible for energy issues. At this time, of course, this was all the Westminster government, there was no Scottish Parliament, not to go near the idea of exploring for oil and gas under the Clyde. Why? Because oil rigs would have got in the way of the nuclear subs. So, although I don't know enough about it to know for definite that there's viable oil and gas under the Clyde, it wouldn't surprise me at all, because the British establishment has always behaved towards Scotland in its own interests, not in Scotland's interests, in its own interests. You saw that with the poll tax, you saw that with just many different things. And according to what Chick Brodie found out, there is in fact a whole offshore oil industry waiting to be exploited underneath the waters of the Clyde and in the Solway Firth, and that is something which was scuppered at the same time as the Thatcher government was wrecking Scotland's industrial base. So getting rid of Trident would actually open up so many job opportunities, a hell of a lot more than the relatively small number of 500 jobs that would go because of kicking out Trident. So I thought that was a major piece of news. Other things I wanted to mention. I just want to return to my trusty atlas, which, as you can tell, I love to do, and just mention something, because I was actually quite surprised to find that while it's perfectly true that England has a much bigger population than Scotland, about something around about 60 million people in England compared to 5 million in Scotland. I might not have those figures exactly right. I know it's 5 point something million in Scotland, approximately 60 million in the rest of the UK, I believe. Maybe a tiny bit less, but anyway. One of the things that I was quite fascinated to discover is that although Scotland geographically is a smaller country than England, it's not as small as people perhaps think. I don't know if other people have this, but I think part of that kind of almost colonial mindset that a lot of Scottish people have, what has been well described as a colonial cringe, I think people sometimes think Scotland's smaller than it is. And it's interesting to look at this map because it comes across quite clearly, because they've marked in Scotland, England, Wales, etc. in different colours. You can see it quite clearly on this that Scotland is actually not that much smaller than England. It's 6/10, 60% the size of England. So I just wanted to make that point because it's something I personally found quite interesting. In my mind, when I think of the map of the British Isles, I always imagine Scotland geographically as being a lot smaller than it really is, and I think that is a direct result of the overall cultural environment that I grew up in which in the media you were just constantly hearing your country put down, most prominently by Tories. Just always talking as though this is some sort of third world backwater rather than the 14th richest country on the planet. Tying in with that point, I was also fascinated to discover that Scotland itself has something like 60% of the oil reserves of the whole of the European Union. Get that, 60%, not 16, 60% of the oil reserves of the whole of the European Union. So when you hear the anti-independence forces blabbering about all the terrible threats and risks faced by an independent Scotland, take it with several bucketfuls of salt and just understand that they're doing that for their own interests. You know, they don't want an independent Scotland, so they're saying pretty much anything to prevent it from happening. Oh, and I just remembered another website which has been a brilliant source of information, and that has the amusing name of Scott Goes Pop, which is a very good pro-independence website. It's quite focused on opinion polls and their analysis, and it really brings out how, as people have pointed out, opinion polls don't just measure opinion, they also can be a way of trying to shape opinion. And I've found that very striking throughout this independence campaign, the attempt by the mainstream media to make it sound like the result of the referendum is a foregone conclusion. You know, it's definitely going to be a no. There's no point really having it because it's going to be a no. Well, I hope that those people are going to get a big shock on the 18th, or rather the 19th of September, and I think they will. I think they will. And tying in with that, I just want to mention the brilliant Radical Independence campaign. Again, you can Google that in 2 seconds, get onto their website. They recently did a massive scale canvassing of thousands and thousands of people in deprived communities in Scotland, and they collated all the results of their canvassing, which, you know, they asked people whether they supported independence or not, and it was overwhelmingly in favour. Now, you have to have a tiny bit of scepticism, because there's a possibility that people are more likely to say yes if they feel, you know, the person asking them is a yes supporter. So, you know, even if you pull the figures down a wee bit to factor in those things, it was still an overwhelming yes, maybe even as high as 70%. So, although that doesn't mean it's in the bag, it's very encouraging, and I think one of the things that's going to determine the outcome of the referendum is the campaigns which people like Radical Independence have pursued to get people to vote. And again, it's one of the things that sickens me about the contemporary UK, that, you know, you're having this referendum, and one of the things that the no side are relying on is the less well off not voting. Because I'll tell you something, if the less well off parts of Scottish society, which is a very, very large section of Scottish society, votes yes, then it will be a yes, and we can start working on actually improving people's lives and sharing out the wealth of the 14th richest country in the world more equally. Now, do I have any other points? Just quickly turn to my laptop screen. Yeah, I think that pretty much covers all the points that I wanted to make. So who knows, maybe someone will actually leave a comment underneath this video. Okay, take care guys, bye bye.